you take a look at these 6 wars now, the Spanish-American, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and Iraq. A pretty good case could be made. Their involvement in each one of these wars was based on some act of deception or some kind of false pretext, or to put it most charitably, a mistaken pretext. Now, I'm going to suggest there's another common denominator to these 6 wars, which is the same group of men who were behind all 6. Now, if I was a critic, and I was hearing this for the first time, I would say, newsflash for you, Mr. Perloff, the guys behind the Spanish-American War will be kind of dead now, don't you think so? How could they be behind the war in Iraq? Well, the organization I'm talking about is an organization that lasts the generations. There's many like that, right? For example, Marx and Engels funded the Communist Party in 1848, yet more than 100 years later, long after Marx and Engels were dead, Mao Zedong took power with the communists in China. There's millions of Republicans in America today, but the founders who go back to the days of Lincoln are all dead. The Christian church goes back to millennia. The mafia, they say, goes back for centuries. I'm talking about an organization like that. As older members are dying off, younger ones are coming in. Well, what organization am I talking about? Well, back in 1970 when I was a hippie, and this is not me, but I used to hang out with guys just like that. It was very common back then to hear other hippies smoking a marijuana cigarette, and they'd say, hey, man, you know, it's really the establishment that's running this country. They used to talk about the establishment, and hippies like to call themselves anti-establishment. And what did they mean by that? Well, what they meant was that there's a wealthy elite in this country that really calls the shots. You know what? I do agree with that. But I disagree with the hippies on their characterization of the establishment. They thought the establishment was conservative, anti-communist, patriotic, and mostly Christian. In other words, it's basically like the John Birch Society, only a lot richer. Now, I think a pretty good definition of the establishment was written by Edith Kermit Roosevelt. She was the granddaughter of Teddy Roosevelt and a syndicated columnist. And I think this description is kind of restrained, but it is a pretty good one coming from this source. She said, the word establishment is a general term for the power elite in international finance, business, and government, who wield most of the power regardless of who's in the White House. Most people are unaware of the existence of this legitimate mafia. Yet the power of the establishment makes itself felt from the professor who seeks a foundation grant to the candidate for a cabinet post or a State Department job. It affects the nation's policies in almost every area. I want to underscore 2 things that Roosevelt said. One is international finance. As we'll see today, the establishment is linked to Wall Street and the banking community, and also regardless of who's in the White House. In other words, to these guys, it doesn't matter whether a Democrat or Republican sitting there, they still have the power. Now, some people might say this, Mr. Perloff, you obviously don't know anything about American government. Because if you did, you know we have government of the people, by the people, and for the people. You know what, Mr. Perloff? We, the voters, we've got all the power. Look, we're the ones who put these guys in office, right? So we get the government that we deserve. And obviously, any policy our government undertakes must be mandated by us because we are the ones who elect these leaders. And you know what, Mr. Perloff? If we don't like the job that our leaders are doing, all we've got to do is vote the rascals out at the next election. So see, Mr. Perloff, there's no sinister power behind the throne, okay? We, the people, the sovereign voters of America, we are the power behind the throne. You know, I agree that in principle, the people are supposed to have the power in this country, but I disagree that we're holding that power in fact. Now, the establishment knows we've got an electoral system, and they've figured ways around it. For one thing, they figured that through their influence within the major mass media and the 2 major parties, they can pretty much predetermine who will get nominated for president. Now, elections are not my focus tonight, but I just want to take one example of that just to back it up a little bit. 1976, Jimmy Carter was elected president. Here's a trivia question for you. 7 months before the Democratic National Convention, what percentage of registered Democrats favored Jimmy Carter for president? Anyone want to guess? Yeah, you're all very close. Yeah, it was less than 4%. Most people didn't even know who Jimmy Carter was. So what happened? Well, Carter was invited to the Tarrytown, New York estate of David Rockefeller, who many consider the kingmaker of the American establishment. Also there was the big new Brzezinski, who Carter later made his national security advisor. And Barry Goldwater, many of you know, former Republican presidential candidate, former senator from Arizona, wrote about this meeting between Carter and these two men. And here's what he said. David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski found Jimmy Carter to be their ideal candidate. They helped him win the nomination and the presidency. To accomplish his purpose, they mobilized the power of the Wall Street bankers and the media controllers. Let me flesh that in a little bit. Media controllers. By the time the nomination convention rolled around that summer, Carter's picture had appeared on the cover of Time magazine 3 times, and Time's cover artists were told to make him look as much like John F. Kennedy as possible. His picture appeared on Newsweek's cover twice by the time of the convention. The New York Times ran a number of puff pieces on Jimmy Carter, including a piece in the New York Times Magazine. The Wall Street Journal ran an editorial saying the best possible Democratic candidate making the best president for America would be Jimmy Carter. And, of course, that swung the businessman vote. And every night, the 3 networks at that time, NBC, ABC, and CBS, inundated people with pictures of Jimmy Carter. And guess what? When the convention came around, Jimmy Carter got the nomination. But do you think that he got that nomination because all across America, the sovereign voters of America spontaneously decided that they wanted Jimmy Carter for president? Or was it because he was picked in a high place and packaged and sold to the American public? I respectfully suggest that it was the latter. And I also respectfully suggest it has been the latter for most of our major party candidates over the last century. But it's not just about elections. The establishment has established bridges of influence to the sitting president, the most important of which is the Council on Foreign Relations, CFR for short, headquartered in New York City with a branch in Washington. And of course, it's the subject of my book, The Shadows of Power, subtitled The Council on Foreign Relations in the American Decline. Now, how does the council influence the president? We're going to talk about that. But first, I'd like to establish this. What is the goal of the Council on Foreign Relations? The goal is world government. And I'm just going to quote Admiral Chester Ward. He was former judge advocate of the U.S. Navy. He was invited into membership in the Council on Foreign Relations. He spent 16 years there, was shocked by what he found. Here's what he wrote. He said, the main purpose of the Council on Foreign Relations is promoting the disarmament of U.S. sovereignty and national independence and submergence into an all-powerful one world government. Well, from Boston, we have the Boston Herald up there. They even were bold enough to do an editorial against the Council on Foreign Relations, in which they call them foreign policy fuzzy thinkers who worship world government. And in my book, The Shadows of Power, I have many quotes, both from the critics and from the Council itself, demonstrating that they advocate the establishment of a world government. By the way, what do we mean by that? What do we mean by world government? Well, today, Brazil is run by the Brazilian government, right? And the Japanese government runs Japan. A world government would be a single government ruling the entire globe. Now, some people would think, come on, Mr. Perloff, that's never going to happen in a million years. We know what's happening right now in Europe, the European Union. You know, at one time, countries like Spain and England were mighty empires. Now they're becoming little more than provinces in the European Union. Their legislatures each year increasingly serve just to ratify decisions made by the European Commission in Brussels. And as you know, they're consolidating their currencies into the euro. They're consolidating their militaries. They say they're going to have a European Pentagon. They have European Constitution. Europe right now is a model of global government on a regional scale. As we'll see tonight, the same thing is planned for North America. Now, the Journal of Foreign Policy for the Council of Foreign Relations is called Foreign Affairs. And I read every issue. Well, I went through every issue before writing The Shadows of Power, going back to its original publication date of 1922. And I found many calls for world government. For example, in the first year of publication, 1922, we read this. Obviously, there's going to be no peace or prosperity for mankind so long as it remains divided into 50 or 60 independent states. The real problem today is that of world government. Let me underscore something that was said here. I found that these guys constantly use the words peace and prosperity to describe what world government will bring us. What they say is, there's nothing worse than war, right?